Risk has always been around, and for much of human existence, that risk was physical risk. A cave person would not survive if he did not take physical risks. But about 600 years ago, you started to see a separation between physical risk and financial risk. And here's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that wealthy individual in England who bought a ship, put sailors on the ship, and sent them off to the Far East to get spices. If the ship came back in one piece, he became wealthy. And if the ship did not make it back, either because it sunk or was attacked by pirates, the sailors were the ones who died. You saw a separation between physical risk and financial risk. Since that time, though, we've started to see that separation increase. Today, when we talk about risk in investing, it's almost never a physical risk, it's a financial risk. So here's the question I want to start with. What is risk? And my answer is don't play with words. What am I talking about? In the 1920s, Frank Knight, an economist, argued that uncertainty was different from risk. And here's the distinction he drew. He said, let's assume you have two individuals drawing from an urn of red and black balls, and the first individual doesn't know how many red balls and black balls there are in the urn. He is uncertain. The second individual, though, knows how many red and black balls there are. He is taking risk because he can give you a probability. I don't like that. To me, risk is risk. Whether you put a number on it or not is your choice. But just because you cannot put a number on it doesn't mean that there's no risk. So with that as the basis, let's go further. To me, a good definition of risk is one that captures the fact that it is dual. Dual in what sense? Risk can't just be viewed as a negative. And here's why. If risk is just a negative, the way we should respond to risk is by avoiding it, right? So the best risk management strategies would be risk avoidance strategies. And that's no way to build a business. In fact, if you look at great businesses and you think of how they became great not by avoiding risk, but by seeking out risk. Not by seeking out every risk, but seeking out the right kind of risk. To me, that is the essence of risk management, to understand that risk is both a positive and a negative. And good risk-taking means that you're weighing the trade-off and you're taking those risks where the good outweighs the bad. No guarantees, but that's the essence of risk-taking. So one of the first starting points for risk is to redefine risk as both good and bad, positive and negative. Now with that in place, let's start off by understanding why we think about risk so much in finance. As human beings, we're risk averse. You see, what are you talking about? Let me try a simple experiment on you. Let's suppose I'm going to flip a coin and I'll pay you $1 if the coin comes up tails on the first flip, and I will pay you nothing if it comes up heads. And I'm going to keep repeating this experiment, right? So each time I flip this coin, your expected value is 50 cents, right? And it builds up over time. If you take this expected value and you build it through, the expected value, if I'm going to do this an infinite number of times, should be infinite. Are you willing to pay an infinite amount for this set of experiments where I'm going to keep flipping $1, if it comes up tails, I'll repeat it and I'll keep going? Well, think about it. I don't know what the answer you would give us, but this is the experiment that Nick Bernoulli ran in the 1700s. He wanted to see whether people would pay an infinite amount of money because the expected value of this series of outcomes is infinite. He found on average that people paid about $2 to play the game. And he started asking why. He basically discovered that people were risk averse. You're saying it took people that long to figure it out? Well, he was the first one who made it concrete. He also noticed that the value that people attached was different for different people. A second big uncovering that risk aversion varies across individuals. And the third thing he found also was that as people got wealthier, they seemed to be willing to pay more. That people got less risk averse as they got wealthier. Those are the building blocks for how we still think about risk aversion in economics and finance. In fact, there are two ways we measure risk aversion. The first is with what we call certainty equivalence. That sounds fancy, but let me give you a very simple example. Let's assume that I give you a bet. 50% of the time you're going to make $1,000, 50% of the time you're going to make nothing. And I ask you how much you'd be willing to pay for that bet. The expected value of that bet is $500, right? 50% times 1,000 plus 50 times 50. The question I would ask you is, how much would you accept as a certainty equivalent, as a guaranteed amount, instead of that expected value? If you said $500, you're risk neutral because you're accepting the expected value, which is uncertain. If you said 400, you're risk averse. If you said 300, you're even more risk averse. It's called a certainty equivalent. And the more risk averse you are, the less you will accept as a guaranteed amount for that uncertainty expected value. That's one way to think about risk aversion. The second, in economics, we call these risk aversion coefficients, is if I can define utility functions. This is the way I measure how happy you are. Those utility functions will have a place in them for your risk aversion, and I can measure your risk aversion with the risk aversion coefficient. Much messier, much more technical, but it comes from utility functions. But they're both measures of risk aversion, and they both try to capture how risk averse you are. Now, over the last decades, we've had studies that looked at differences in risk aversion across people, how risk averse people are, and there are 4 sets of studies that draw these conclusions. The first are experimental studies, where you take 15, 20, 25 people and you offer them these choices to see what they choose, and based on these controlled experiments, you make judgments about risk aversion. The second are surveys, where you ask people how they deal with risk in the real world, how much insurance they buy, what portfolio choices they make, and you draw from those conclusions about risk aversion. The third, and this is one of my favorite devices, you look at what people pay for risky assets, stocks, bonds. You're in a sense getting from the price a measure of how risk averse they are. And finally, if you go to casinos, you go to game shows, you go to the racetrack, you're getting a measure of how people deal with risk almost on a minute-by-minute basis by looking at what they bet on and how much they're willing to bet. Now, if you look at the collective evidence from this risk aversion, here's what we seem to have uncovered. And I'm not claiming this as a generalization, but these are general findings. When men are compared with women, at least these studies seem to find that men are less risk averse than women when it comes to small bets. So if I offer you a $50 bet on a game, men tend to be much more cavalier about accepting small bets. But as the bets get larger, men and women seem to be about equally risk averse. Young men are less risk averse than young women, but as people age, men and women are about equally risk averse. Studies also have looked at, does your risk aversion increase or decrease as you become more experienced at a particular set of bets? So for instance, a study compared bids from naive students, people who'd never done this, in construction industry experts for bidding on real estate, and they found that as people became more experts, the more expertise you had, the less risk averse you became. Something to think about when you think about traders out there. That traders, as they trade longer and longer, actually become less risk averse because they either learn more about the market, or worse, they think they've learned more about the market. Young versus old people. No surprise here. Young people are less risk averse than older people. Something to again keep in mind as you watch the aging of Japan and Europe. Perhaps that has something to say about how much risk aversion you're going to see, both in product and financial markets there. And finally, when you compare across races and cultures, the evidence is actually interesting because contrary to conventional wisdom, there are no conservative cultures. It looks like risk aversion is about the same across cultures, across races. People are more alike than they're different. Now, that said, over the last few decades, especially in the last 35 to 40 years, the area of behavioral finance has found that there are some quirks in the way we take risks. The first is how you present a bet seems to make a difference in how people react to it. Let me give you an example. I said, would you rather save 200 people out of 600 people, or accept a 1/3 probability that everybody will be saved? It's exactly the same thing mathematically, but while the two statements are mathematically equivalent, more people said they would prefer to save 200 out of 600 people than accept a 1/3 probability that everybody will be saved. Here's the second choice. Would you rather take $750 or a 75% chance of winning 1,000? That's an easy one, right? Because you're risk averse, you say, I'll take the $750, it's guaranteed. Let me change the question a little bit. Would you rather lose 750 guaranteed or have a 75% chance of losing $1,000? Here it looks like more people prefer to have a 75% chance of losing 1,000 rather than a guaranteed loss. That's called loss aversion. Changing the sign seems to change the way we look at those bets. Then you have this notion of what's called myopic loss aversion. And what that effectively means is giving people more frequent feedback on what's happening to their bets and investments seems to make them more risk averse. Something to keep in mind in an age where we get feedback continuously about what's happening to our portfolios. Here's something that shouldn't surprise you. People are more willing to take big risky bets with other people's money than with their own money, with house money than with their own money. And that's basically something that comes from, I think, within. So if you come into a casino and I hand you money at the door, even though it's now your money, the fact that I handed you the money rather than it being money that you earned makes a difference in how you bet with that money. And finally, here's an interesting phenomenon. When people lose money on bets, when they lose money in casinos, it looks like they get less risk averse in trying to get back to break even. In other words, they start taking bigger and bigger risks just to get back to break even. Something that every casino knows, but something to keep in mind. These are things that go against classic economics in terms of risk aversion. But this is what behavioral finance has brought to the table. But in summary, here's what we've learned about ourselves and risk aversion. That we're collectively risk averse, that we're more so when we have big stakes and we're small. There are differences in risk aversion across groups of people, males, females here. But those differences are far smaller than what we share in common. There are quirks in risk-taking behavior. We're far more affected by losses than equivalent gains. That loss aversion kicks in. And when presented with risky choices, the way we're presented those choices seems to make a difference in whether we take those choices. We're more willing to take risks with found money, house money. And finally, there are two scenarios where we seem to abandon risk aversion and become risk-seeking. One is when we see a chance of making a huge amount of money with a very small bet. Hey, that explains the reason we take on, we buy lottery tickets. And the other is when you've lost money and you're trying to get back to break even. We seem to abandon risk aversion. So keep that in mind as we start developing risk models, because this might explain why people behave the way they do and sometimes why they behave strangely.